Oops, okay, sorry about that. So welcome and good morning. Welcome to the people attending in person and welcome to the people attending via webinar. So I just want to set some expectations regarding the information you're going to receive today. We'll not be giving you your 2018 rate today. However, we will give you your rate based on current data that had we transitioned to the new enhanced model in 2017, this is what the change would have been. And I'm kind of nervous, so I just skipped over telling you who I am. I'm Ann Schultz. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for the board, and I'll be talking about the agricultural sector and the impacts of the rate model changes on that. So we've scheduled about an hour for questions following the presentation today. However, depending on the number of questions, we have quite a few people attending via webinar. If we can't get to them all within the hour after the presentation, we will get back to you at a later time, hopefully within a few days. And for those attending in person, we have a question sheet. I don't think it'll be a problem getting to your questions today, but if we don't, please note your question on those pages and we'll address them later. So there is a website, Ask WCB at wcbsas.com, where we can you can submit your questions either today or sometime in the future should you have questions after you've thought about the presentation for a while. So our agenda today is we're going to give you a little bit of a background on the WCB, why we exist, why we did the rate model review, and again, we are going to be showing you the impact on your rate code had we implemented the new model in 2017. The 2017 rates were determined, were set based on the current model. We did not change over in 2017. And that was because there's some fairly large swings in some of the industry codes, and the board felt that we needed to educate our stakeholders, our employers who pay the premiums, before we proceed with changes to the model. And we will be talking and asking for your input on how we transition to the new model, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. Oops. So why do we pay WCB premiums? Prior, or in the early 1900s, if someone was injured at work, they had no insurance to help them with the costs of their lost wage or the medical costs related to their injury. So if a worker got hurt, his only recourse was to sue his employer. From the employer side, back in the early 1900s, he didn't have insurance often either to pay for those kind of workplace injuries. And so if he was found responsible for the injury and the court awarded the injured worker a large settlement, it could be very financially burdensome to the employer. So what started to happen is that when injured workers would get hurt, often, it's quite costly to go through a court action against their employer. So they would become reliant upon the social security systems. So in Canada, specifically in Ontario in the early 1900s, government recognized that this was starting to be a problem with respect to the draw on social security systems with respect to costs related to injured workers. So based on what was happening in Europe at that time, the Ontario government commissioned a study by a lawyer, I believe he was, Sir William Meredith. So Sir William Meredith crafted a workers' compensation model that he called the historic compromise. So this compromise meant that workers gave up their right to sue their employer in exchange for medical and wage loss benefits, and employers assumed the cost of the system in exchange for protection from legal action. So what happened is employers paid for insurance and workers gave up their right to sue. So all jurisdictions across Canada and jurisdictions even across the world have adopted this model, the historic compromise, and have their own workers' compensation legislation. It's evolved over the years. However, the principles that Meredith outlined are the foundation of the comp systems today. So one of the main principles is that it is a no-fault compensation system, which means that workers are paid benefits regardless of how the injury occurred. The worker and the employer waive the right to sue, and there's no argument over responsibility for the injury. The second principle is that there is security of benefits. So this means that a fund is established to guarantee funds to pay benefits into the future for the current year and into the future. So what that kind of means is injuries happen today, but the cost of those injuries could go out 50 years into the future. And Meredith said there had to be security of benefits so that the injured workers were assured that they would continue to receive their wage loss and medical costs into the future. The other aspect that Meredith outlined is that there should be collective liability in the system, which means that the covered employers on a whole share the liability of the costs in the system. All employers contribute to a common fund, and financial liability becomes their collective liability. And this is foundational to all insurance systems, including the workers' compensation. So if you think about, your house insurance, for example, you belong to a risk pool based on the kind of house you have, where it's located, and so forth. And you share in the cost of insuring all similar properties with other property owners in that risk pool. Meredith also said that there should be independent administration, which means that organizations who administer the workers' compensation insurance should be separate from government to avoid interference with respect to rate setting and determining eligibility to benefits. The last Meredith principle is that workers' compensation should have exclusive jurisdiction, which means that only workers' compensation organizations provide workers' compensation insurance, and all compensation claims are directed solely to the board. The compensation board is the final decision maker and final authority for all claims. This principle supports the collective liability of the workers' compensation systems, as well as security of benefits. This next slide goes through our rate setting process. So the first step when in the rate setting process is putting employers into industry codes based on a classification system. We need to ensure that we collect the right enough premiums for the future costs of today's injuries. So the classification system helps us to allocate costs to like industries. In Saskatchewan, we have approximately 45,000 employers, and right now they're assigned to 50 rate codes based on their primary industry. The second step is that we need to estimate the costs of the injuries and determine industry premium rates. So we do this by looking at the collective experience of the employers in a particular rate code, and all employers in that rate code pay the same industry premium rate. We'll get into a little more detail around how that all happens with respect to how we project out the costs in the following slides. And then step 3 of the rate setting process is we consider individual employer experience and apply what's called the experience rating program adjustment. So that can result in either a surcharge or a discount depending on the employer's experience within their risk pool or their rate code. So with the experience rating program, there are 2 programs. There's a standard program for smaller employers, and the advanced program, which is for larger employers. We determine where an employer falls based on their premiums. So in the standard program, if employers have fewer than $21,000 in premiums over a 3-year period, their experience rating surcharge or discount is based on the frequency of injury that happens to them in that 3-year period. So the standard program has a maximum discount of 25% and a maximum surcharge of 75%. Approximately 88% of the employers in Saskatchewan are in the standard program, so approximately 88% of our employers would be considered small. The advanced program is a cost-based program for employers with premiums exceeding $21,000 over a 3-year period. So it works a little differently in the advanced program. This program is based on cost. So they are compared to the costs of other employers in their code, and if they're better, they will receive a discount, and if they're worse, they will receive a surcharge. So the maximum discount is 30%, and the maximum surcharge for the larger employers is 200%. So why did we need a rate model review, or why did we need to review the rate model? The rate model review was recommended in the asset liability study, which was conducted by an external actuary back in 2014. So what's an asset liability study? The asset liability study basically looked at the matching of our investments to our liability stream, because remember I said that costs can go, out into the future for current year injuries, and we need to ensure that we have enough money to ensure security of benefits into the future. So the asset liability looked at our asset structure compared to the liability stream and determined whether our investment earnings expectations are in line. As part of that study, though, they also looked at the rate model and suggested that we should review our rate model, because we need to earn a certain rate of return on our funds that invest, and we also need to charge the right premiums. And when we determine what premiums we're going to charge you, we also look at the future costs and what interest we can earn on the funds we invest in order to fund future costs. The other thing that we heard is that from employer groups is that our model was not reactive enough to improvements in injury rates. And so with respect to that, we decided or we undertook the rate model review and the actuary came up with several recommendations, which we'll be going through in future slides. The actuary who did the rate model review was also the same actuary that did our asset liability study. So Eckler, in his study and the resulting report, reinforced rate model review guiding principles. The premium setting process should appropriately balance these sometimes competing principles. The rate model needs to be robust and sustainable and be actuarially sound, which means it's going to be able to collect enough premiums to fund future costs and be equitable. So 2 of the competing principles are accountability and collective liability. Accountability talks to fairness and equity and incentives for prevention. So the rate model should ensure that premiums are paid by today's employers to cover the costs of the injured workers during the premium period. So this covers the concept of intergenerational equity, that today's employers pay for their costs into the future and not rely on future employers to pay those costs. The other thing with accountability is that it should be based on the employer's experience. So if the employer's experience is getting better or worse, the rate model should reflect that. The balance to the accountability side is collective liability. And what this talks to is the fact that employers, because it is an insurance program, should be jointly responsible for unusually costly or expensive claims, and that they should not be burdened for an unusually costly or expensive claim. So in my example before of the house insurance, if you were to lose your house in a fire, say, most people could not afford to replace their $400,000 or $500,000 or $300,000 home. Others in their risk pool help them to rebuild and recover that house. It's the same with the Workers' Compensation Board. Expensive claims are shared in a collective way by all employers. So on the flip side of accountability and collective liability is rate stability and predictability. So with rate stability, we want to ensure that rates don't whipsaw around, that they're stable, they're predictable, but yet we want them to be reactive to when there are changes, either negatively or positively. So for example, if your cost experience gets worse, we want the model to be able to react to capture those costs. But if you're getting better, we want the model to be able to react to capture the improvements being seen. So what was critical to the review process? It was to maintain a high level of fairness and transparency in the overall rate setting process. We want predictability of premium costs so that premiums collected in the future are sufficient to cover the expected cost and the experience happening today, and that the model should be fair and equitable to all employers, and that the model follow actuarial standards. So actuarial standards address the financial security aspect of the rate model, which is one of the Meredith principles. The model needs to collect enough money to cover the costs. And we want to do it in a fair and equitable manner that is transparent. So this slide summarizes the rate model review findings. We have the Eckler report online, which goes into a lot more detail about all of the recommendations, and if you would like further information, I would direct you to that. So we'll be reviewing all of these rate model findings and the impact on the agriculture industry codes in the next little bit here. But of the recommendations that are here, one recommendation that we're not going to be speaking specifically to is classification. So, as I said before, the first step in establishing a rate for an industry code is that you have to be grouped into a classification. And currently we have 50 rate codes, and a lot of them are quite small and not as credible. And credibility is the concept where we use your cost experience to predict what your future cost experience, and we'll be talking about that in more detail. So with respect to classification, Eckler recommended that we implement a process to periodically review classification of employers. Right now, it's kind of an ad hoc process with respect to when we do classification reviews. However, in order to establish this process would require that we set up a process that we currently don't have, so we need to establish that. It requires analysis and consultation with employers. So right now, the board is not acting on this recommendation to set up the process. We will be setting up a process in the future. But we will be relying on the credibility recommendation to kind of offset and countermeasure the fact that we aren't looking at our classification system. And Eckler's recommendation with respect to classification was that we have industries that are large enough, have enough cost experience that they kind of stand on their own. So we will be working to that. So in the short to near future, we're going to be using the credibility part of the model to analyze industries who can less stand on their own with respect to predictability of their future costs. So overall, Eckler found that the current process for setting employer premium rates is sound. We're collecting enough money, not too much at the board level, but we're collecting enough at the board level. However, he thought that there could be opportunities for us to look at enhancements to the model at the industry code level, again, to go back to those principles of accountability, collective liability, reactivity, and predictability. So the board has approved the recommendations for refinements to the existing model for 2018. However, we're here today and in the next while asking for employer input as to how we transition to the new model, because for some industries, based on what we're seeing when you compare the 2017 old to the 2017 new, there are significant impacts. So we needed some time to share the aspects of the new model and educate on that and talk to our stakeholders about phase-in. So that is why the board did not approve the implementation of the new model for 2017. However, the changes will be effective for 2018. And what we're showing you, I'm sorry I'm going over this, but it's very important that these aren't your 2018 rates. It's a proxy based on what would have happened had we implemented in 2017. As I mentioned earlier, Eckler did say that the current rate model is sound. It does collect the right amount of money. And when we compared the 2017 old model to new model at the board level, we had the same average board rate of $1.24. So now we'll be getting into the industry impacts on each of the various recommendations. So the industry impacts in the following slides will show the difference of the 2017 premium rates under the current model compared to what the enhanced model is showing. And the 2018 rates will be released in the fall of 2017 and will include updated experience. So when we set rates, we look at 5 years of experience to predict the future. For the 2017 rates, we would have been using the period 2011 to 2015, and for 2018, we'll be using 2012 to 2016. So the industry impacts provided in the presentation are comparing the final 2017 industry premium rates to what the 2017 rate would have been using the enhanced model. So the first recommendation that I spoke to a little bit before with respect to classification is credibility of industries. So what is credibility? So credibility is the extent you can use an industry's past experience to predict what the future experience for claims costs will be. Under the current classification structure, there's a number of small industry codes that have lower credibility, which make it more difficult to predict future claims experience. The current model calculates credibility using premiums. And under the current model, only 10 rate codes would have credibility greater than 75%. So the way we calculate credibility now, we'll assign a percentage of credibility based on premiums, and only 10 codes have greater than 75% credibility. With the enhanced model, the consultant Eckler recommended that where rate codes are not fully credible, the experience should be complemented with a longer experience period, up to 10 years, say, rather than the current 5. So in the current model, we calculate the credibility based on premiums. If you're not fully credible, we supplement the credibility with board level experience, so the average experience across the board. The Eckler is saying you shouldn't do that. You should be looking at the industry's own experience and complement it, if they're not credible, with a longer period. The other recommendation he made was that we should calculate credibility based on claims costs rather than premiums. So the new model will calculate credibility based on claims costs over the claim period. And once an industry rate code reaches approximately $16.5 million, it would be considered fully credible. Because of this change coming up in 2018, there will be 23 rate codes, or about half of the rate codes, with credibility above 75%. So this change will make industries more accountable because they will be relying more on their experience. Now, Eckler said where codes are less credible with the new formula, 5 years really isn't a good predictor of what the future year's costs will be, so you should complement that with 10 years of experience for that rate code. So what this means is, say a rate code is 60% credible, they've got about $10 million of costs. We would base 60% of the calculation on their 5-year costs, and then the remaining 40% would be based on their 10-year costs. So we would use the combination of those two pieces and come up with an average in order to predict what the future year's cost might be for that rate code. In general, rate codes that are going to be negatively impacted by this aspect of the rate model change will see an increase in that component of the rate code because their experience is worse than what the board level experience was, and or if we have to use 10 years of average costs, those 10-year average costs would be higher than their 5-year average costs. On the other hand, rate codes that are positively impacted by credibility would be seeing a decrease because their experience is better than the board level experience, which increases their costs under the current model, or their 10-year costs are lower than what their 5-year claims costs were. Again, this change is being implemented to increase accountability by removing the use of board level experience and only using the experience of the rate code in order to predict the future costs. So the impact of this on the light agricultural operations rate code, the impact has been an increase in this component of the rate model of 11 cents because for A11, their experience is worse than the overall board experience, and in the enhanced model at 67% credibility, we have to include 33% of their 10-year costs in the calculation to predict the future costs, and their 10-year costs are higher than their 5-year costs. So those two things in combination have increased that component of the rate by 11 cents. For A21, farming and ranching, farming and ranching's experience is pretty similar to the overall board experience. There's very little impact there. However, in the enhanced model, at 49% credible, we will be using 51% of 10-year costs in the calculation to predict future costs, and those costs were higher than the 5-year, which basically added the entire 24 cents for this rate code. For grain elevators, inland terminals, A31. Their experience is a little bit better than the overall board experience, so their costs related to this component will go down. However, the amount that it's going down is offset by the 10-year costs being greater than their 5-year costs, and they're only 38% credible, so it kind of washes out and it's got a 0-cent impact. The next recommendation that Eckler put in front of the board had to do with respect to the use of indicators to predict costs. So the current model uses the number of time loss claims as a key indicator of an industry's experience. So we look at the number of time loss claim counts within your industry. This was true when the model was first created back in the 90s. There was a strong correlation between time loss count, injuries, and costs. However, in recent years, with the emergence of new trends such as return to work, increasing medical costs, and time loss counts dropping off very fast, it's no longer a good predictor of what future cost experience will be. So we've seen a significant reduction in time loss claims, but not a similar reduction in the cost of claims. This makes the time loss metric less predictable or less valid as a way of projecting future costs. So the recommendation was that we should look at the change in the workforce and compare that to current year costs. So the change in workforce is the estimate of the change of the number of insured workers in the rate year. The other aspect of indicators to predict costs, because the time loss counts were dropping so fast, it was not a good predictor or a good estimate of what the cost per claim would be. The board several years ago intervened in the model because we knew we wouldn't collect enough money because the cost per claim was too low, and we would blend rate years to come up with the current rate. So for example, 2017 would be a blend of 2017 and 2016 rates. Eckler also recommended that we discontinue that practice with moving to a model more based on costs. So that's the other aspect of the indicator change that we'll be showing in a few seconds here. So for light agricultural operations, A11, under the enhanced model, time loss counts have been trending upwards. This means that time loss counts cause the rate model to expect a corresponding increase in the claims liability. However, using the workforce metric causes us to expect an increase in liabilities that is in line with the economy. Because the economy isn't growing so fast, this has resulted in a decrease for that part of the model. So we take away using the workforce rather than time loss counts has resulted in about a 7 cent of that 21 cent drop with respect to the change of indicators, and the balance is removing the blending of the 2 years to come up with the current year rate. So for A21, this part of the model change will reduce their rate by 21 cents. This is the similar to A21 for the farming and ranching rate code. Time loss counts have been decreasing slightly. This has resulted in an increase to that particular component of the rate. However, it is offset by a larger decrease due to the blending of the rate codes between the 2 years. For A31, grain elevators and inland terminals, the 5-cent drop in that component of the rate, again, is the blending rate more than offsets the increase due to using workforce rather than time loss counts to predict future costs. So the next recommendation that was considered in the enhanced model had to do with costly claim pooling. So currently, the current model pools pension costs only for long-term claims above a fixed amount of $90,000 at the class level. So that means that the only thing that gets pooled with respect to expensive costs are related to pension costs. Above $90,000 are pooled just in the agricultural class. What the recommendation was is that we need to look at all costs, not just pension. So all costs should be done or should be looked at with respect to what the cap should be. Eckler recommended that large claims should be done using an index limit of the maximum insurable earnings. He had suggested 3 to 5 times. However, when we did further analysis, the recommendation that we took to the board was 3 times the maximum insurable wage, because using 3 times meant that a larger portion of employers would benefit from making this change. Had we stuck with the 5 times recommendation, it would have only been approximately 20% of the rate codes benefiting. So we will apply all costs to the rate code to a maximum of 3 times the maximum insurable earnings, which is about $251,000 currently. The remaining costs, so costs for a claim above that $251,000 cap, will be pooled at the board level. So they're going to go into a pool at the board level and then allocated back out to the industries based on their cost experience. So the impact on the ag codes for A11 light agricultural operations, this rate code is going to be seeing an increase in this component of the rate model of 13 cents, because under the old model, their average pension costs were 187% higher than the average Class A pension costs. So the other rate codes in the agricultural class were supplementing the pension costs in A11. So that's going to go away, and as a result of that, they will see a 13-cent increase. So they have higher pension costs than their fellow rate codes, and also they had less costs that were over the cap in the new model, so there will be less benefit in the enhanced rate. So A11 will be accountable for more of its costs in the new model going ahead. Under A21, farming and ranching. So farming and ranching had lower pension costs in the old model than the average, so they will benefit. However, they did have this benefit would be offset by some of the costs that were in excess of that $251 million or $250,000 cap. So there would be more costs pooled, and they also get a benefit from that. So they had more costs over the cap, and they had lower pension costs. So they're benefiting by about 5 cents with this change. Grain elevators and inland terminals. don't benefit so much from the pension costs because they were pretty well right on. However, they did have some costs in excess of the cap. Therefore, some of those costs will go into that board level pool, and they will see a benefit of, it works out to about 1 cent. Eckler also looked at the way the WCB treats fatalities and recommended that fatalities should be charged to industries based on actual or average costs. So right now, all industries pay the same 4 cents for fatalities, regardless of whether they had a fatality or not. The board looked at this recommendation and decided that really a fatality is really no different than a very severe claim, and that all fatalities should be treated like any other claim. So what that means is that fatalities will be treated like any other claim. They'll be subject to that costly claim pooling I just talked about, and as well as to the tailing provision, which I'll talk about in a bit here. So the WCB just decided to treat fatality claims as any other claim and have it subject to the caps and the pooling provisions within the rate model. So the impact of this will be shown in the next slides. This move to treat the claims or fatalities as a severe claim or any other claim has really promoted or helps with the accountability so that fatalities are charged to industries that they occur in. Now, for the light agricultural operations, A11, there will be a slight 3 cent increase over what they would have paid under the old model with respect to fatalities. There was 1 fatality in the period 2011 to 2015. A21, basically there's been no change. They will be comparing the 2017 under the current model to the enhanced model. The calculation worked out to the same, so it's 0. So they continue to pay 4 cents. And in A31, grain elevators and inland terminals, there is a 1 cent increase. This rate code had 2 fatalities in the period, 2011 to 2015. So it's very difficult to isolate the impact of one recommendation on an industry premium rate. The rate code is a dynamic system and it has many moving parts. So the fatalities will work with the costly claim pooling as well as the long-term claims, which we'll be talking about in a second here, and credibility. So credibility also impacts how fatalities, the change in the fatalities impact a rate code. So the long-term claims recommendation has to do with how we treat costs that are in the averaging period to predict future costs. So as I said earlier, claim costs can go 50 years into the future. But that also means that today we're incurring, when we look at claims costs, we're looking at some claims costs that could be 50 years old. So currently all costs, regardless of how many years ago that injury happened, are included in determining the industry's cost for the rate year. So the 5-year cost experience can include the cost of some really old claims that could be very, very old. This impacts equity of the process because those claims could have been, while they're in that industry code, could have been by an entirely different generation of employers. So continuing with this kind of violates the principle of fairness. Industry practices have changed a lot. So the technology is different that we're using. Safety and prevention practices are different. So some of those injuries that occurred many years ago may not even occur today. And continuing to burden today's employers with those costs is not fair. So under the current process, a rate code is never truly free of those really old costs. They can stay with you for 50 years if a very young worker was injured many years ago. So Eckler said this is not fair, and it does not promote reactivity, that the model should reflect what's happening in more recent experience. So Eckler recommended that we look at a period of time, I think he said 7 to 10 years, as more recent experience when we calculate the costs that we include to determine the future costs, and that costs beyond or that are older than that cutoff period of 7 years should be pooled and shared at the board as a collective liability issue. We did some analysis at the board and determined that if we cut it off after 7 years, approximately 75% of the costs would remain with the industry code and approximately 25% would be pooled. So it's kind of it increases the reactivity and accountability by emphasizing most recent experience. So the impact on the respective rate codes will be shown in the next few slides here. On A11, light ag operations, A11 had a smaller proportion of costs in the long-term, like greater than 7-year part, so their pooling costs are lower, and this will actually increase their rates by 13 cents. They have less costs being pooled over 7 years. A21, however, farming and ranching, has a larger portion of costs in the long-term part, so their pooling will benefit them by 36 cents. So for that component of the rate model, it's going down 36 cents because they had more costs in that greater than 7-year-old period. A31, grain elevators and inland terminals, also had a larger share of costs in that greater than 7-year portion. So these costs, they see a slight benefit of 1 cent. So the other thing that Eckler looked at was the way we allocate the administration costs of the board in the rate model. And he said that our costs between fixed and variable components should align with our actual cost structure. So fixed costs at the board include the costs incurred whether a claim happens or not. So this would be, I guess, all costs related to, for example, the executive, the board, IT infrastructure, employer services, because you have to register your claim, you have to apply for clearance certificates. So those are not claims-related costs, and we treat them as a fixed cost to be allocated based on your proportionate share of payroll. However, variable claim costs are costs that relate to administering claims. It would include, things like benefits for the staff administering claims and a larger proportion of some of the prevention activities. So Eckler said you need to align your percentages that you're charging based on the fixed and the variable component based on our actual structure. And right now, in the old model or the current model, we only have 10% of the board budget or cost is being determined as being fixed, and 90% are treated as variable. However, when we looked at our actual cost structure, about 30% of our costs are fixed and 70% are variable. So in general, what this will mean is that if you are a high cost rate code, you will likely see your premium drop a little bit because you're moving from 90% variable to 70% variable. If you are a lower premium rate code with low costs, you'll likely see your rate go up because you're going to be assuming a larger chunk of the fixed when we move that percentage from 10 to 30%. So these shifts just are attempting to ensure that all rate codes contribute their fair share of the administrative costs. So for A11, there is a decrease to the overall rate component of 14 cents, and that is because of the variable portion dropping from 90 to 70%. So this is a relatively high cost rate code. They're going to benefit because of the move to reduce that portion from 90 to 70%. Likewise, in A21, farming and ranching, there's a decrease of 6 cents. And this relates to, again, the fact that the variable costs will now be charged at 70% rather than 90% of the board cost structure. And in A31, on the other hand, is a relatively low cost rate code. Their costs will be going up with respect to admin because they're going to be assuming a higher percentage or a higher chunk of the fixed component. So as you can see on these last 3 slides, the changes to the rate are in various categories, and they, some are up, some are down. And all of these components work together to come up with the final rate. So again, this is a proxy comparing 2017 enhanced rate to what your 2017 current rate was. For A11, there was a 6 cent increase, or a 2.1% increase in their rate code, moving to the enhanced model had we implemented in 2017. In A21, farming and ranching, they would see a 28 cent drop, or a 16.5% drop, had we implemented in 2017. And in A31, there is a decrease of 4 cents comparing the old model to the new model, or a 5.7% decrease. So to put this in perspective, if we go back to A11, that 2.1% increase equates to about $56,000. There's 452 employers in this rate code, so the average increase, if we implement in 1 year, would be $124 per employer. For A21, the premium impact because of the decrease would be about $335,000. There's approximately 1,170 employers in this rate code. This would be a decrease of $286 per employer. And in A31, the overall impact, if we would have implemented in 2017, is about $57,000 decrease. And over the 52 employers, works out to about $1,100 per employer. So what's next? So we're here today to ask your input on how we transition to this new model. The board has made the decision to proceed with the changes to the various elements that we went over, and they all work together to come up with a model, or to come up with a rate, for you. So we have several options. Do we implement all in 1 year? So that means that those seeing an increase would see the increase all in 1 year. Those seeing a decrease would see the decrease in all in 1 year. Do we spread the impact over a couple of years? Or are there other options available, like, only implementing increases or decreases beyond a threshold? Because the important thing to remember is that we still need to collect the same amount of revenue. Like, the pie is the same size. So if somebody goes down, somebody will have to go up. So what we're asking for is your input on how we transition. And there's mechanisms available for you to do that. We have set up a website to provide your feedback, the www.wcbsas.com/feedback. There's a poll on there where you can either choose one of the options there or provide another option. The board will consider all of these feedback that we get in deciding on how we transition. So again, I'd just like to reiterate that these are not your 2018 rates. This is a proxy based on what would have happened had we implemented in 2017. I know we've presented a lot of information here today, so we can take some questions for about the next hour. And if you can't think of something today and you want to go back and review the presentation, it will be online. Have a look at the presentation, and if you have questions, in the next little while, please submit them to Ask WCB. So I guess we'll open up for questions right now, and we'll keep it, there's only 4 of you, so we'll keep it to 1 question per, but if you have several questions, I'm sure we'll be able to get to them, and as well if there's anything that comes from the people attending via webinar. Is there any questions? Yeah. Could you please use the mic, because we're being recorded.
I just wanted to know if the discounts and the surcharges would still apply with this model, or are they eliminated completely?
Yeah, the discounts and surcharges are not part of the model, so we calculate the base rate, and then the experience rating program kicks in. So it's kind of 2 different programs, but your net rate is the reflection of this plus the experience rating program. Anything online? Again, if you think of something next week, please send us the question via the website, and we'll get back to you. Well, thank you for coming, and if you haven't had lunch, please have lunch, and we look forward to hearing from you on the transition.